This is Mike Reed with cEntellect, and this is this week's proprietary research and analysis. This week's topic is U.S. Petrochemicals, a forward view. The reason this is an important topic is as the U.S. ramps up oil and gas production, a byproduct of which the downstream petrochemicals. And the question becomes, can we consume those petrochemicals internal within the U.S., or do we have to export those petrochemicals? And I think the answer is a combination of both. As we go through the analysis, you're going to see that the balance between domestic consumption and exports will largely dictate the price. Let's back up a minute and talk about the end products of this petrochemical value chain. The first end product is a plastic known as polyethylene. Polyethylene is the most common plastic in the world. Well north of 80 million tons a year are produced. This is a thermal plastic. It melts under temperature. It typically comes in three grades. This is PET, P-E-T. It also comes in low density and high density variations. The second most common plastic in the world is polypropylene. This is well north of 50 million tons a year produced. This is not a thermal plastic. This is dishwasher safe. Let's move to the value chain we're going to be talking about today. The first is ethane, which is a precursor to ethylene, which is a precursor to polyethylene, the plastic. The second value chain is propane, which is a precursor to propylene, which is a precursor to polypropylene. What we're going to do is walk through three things. The first is pricing, stocks, and exports for all six over the past 5 years. Then we're going to forecast each one of those attributes for each one of those six forward 3 years. And then we're going to spin out a causality storyboard of what we see happening between price, stocks, and exports. The first comment I want to make is from a material handling standpoint as we talk about exports. Some of these are problematic to export. Why? Ethane and ethylene are exported as a gas under extremely low temperatures, about 155 degrees minus Fahrenheit. Compared to LNG, that's relatively warm. LNG is at minus 260. These are at 155. The two plastics, which are polyethylene and polypropylene, that's bulk handling. But then propane and propylene is transported under pressure, typically about 200 psi. So just to be clear, exporting these petrochemicals is much more of a challenge than exporting a liquid such as crude or refined products. What we want to do here is walk through some charts. The first chart on the left is pricing for ethane, ethylene, and polyethylene. What's notable here is if you look at the end of the pricing on the right-hand side, or recent pricing, you see an uptick in ethane. That uptick in ethane is caused by a jump in our ability to export ethane. You also see a collapse in ethylene prices because we don't have the ability to export ethylene today, with the exception of one small terminal in the Houston ship channel. Let's move to the right-hand side for the propane, propylene, and polypropylene value chain. Nothing really jumps out here from a pricing perspective. Let's move on to stocks. On the left-hand side, we see ethane stocks jumping. We see ethylene stocks largely unchanged. Keep in mind that these stocks are stored at minus 155, so the objective is to not store these stocks. On the right-hand side, you see propane and propylene. Again, these are stored under pressure at 200 psi. Note the seasonality of propane because it's also a heating fuel in addition to the petrochemical value chain. Propylene at the bottom is relatively small and difficult to store. Let's move on to exports. Exports on ethane, ethylene, polyethylene. What jumps out at you is a rapid jump in ethane exports over the last 5 years, relatively unchanged in terms of ethylene and polyethylene exports. The chart on the right for propane, propylene, and polypropylene, you see a jump in propane exports. You also see a jump in propylene exports, relatively unchanged in polypropylene. The takeaway from both charts is the plastic exports are largely unchanged over the last 5 years. When we spin these forward 3 years and we look at the compounded annual growth rate between 2018 to 19, 19 to 20, and 20 to 21, and we spin that into a storyboard, things start to get interesting. We have 4 storyboards to walk through. The first storyboard is we look at ethane exports up 24%. Well, you'd normally think if ethane exports were up 24%, that export would lift ethane price, and it didn't. In this analysis, ethane price was actually down 5%. The reason behind that is this suggests that ethane supply will exceed ethane exports, so the glut's actually continuing to increase while we're increasing ethane exports. Now, with ethane price down 5%, that would pull down its forward value chain component, which is ethylene. The analysis pulled it down far more than we expected, but pulling down ethylene price 36%. I think the reason for that is ethylene, again, is problematic to handle. And ethylene price falling 30% will also pull down its downstream, which is polyethylene price 4%. So in summary, we see that value chain bearish. Even though ethane exports jump, domestic supply of ethane is greater than the export of ethane, price still comes down. The bottom side of this value chain is ethane exports jumping 24%. We see it pulling down ethylene stocks 21%. Why? Because instead of converting ethane to ethylene, instead of doing that conversion, which would increase ethylene stocks, you slow down that conversion because you're exporting it, and ethylene stocks fall by 21%. The second value chain we want to walk through is ethylene exports up 2%. Although this is modest, we still see ethylene price falling 36%. The reason for that is this suggests that ethylene production will still be far greater than our ability to export it. So you see ethylene price continuing to tumble. We also see polyethylene exports falling 3%. So if the upstream ethylene exports jump 2%, that will pull down the downstream stocks. And then those two combined, we see it pulling down polyethylene price 4%. So in summary, a very similar pattern, exports jumping, but not enough to offset price. We see domestic production increasing faster. The third value chain we're going to talk about, or storyboard, is propane stocks. We see propane stocks jumping 17%. That makes sense with the ongoing oil and gas production ramp up. We see that pulling down propane price. That makes sense. We also see it jumping propylene stocks 11%. And the reason for that is as the upstream stocks jump, before it jumps too high, you're going to go ahead and increase the conversion to propylene, jumping the downstream stocks 11%. So that makes sense. Those two combined pull down propylene price 5%. And the fourth and final storyboard is we see polypropylene stocks jumping 4%, which will lift polypropylene price 2%. So the summary for this is, yes, we're ramping up our export terminal capability in the U.S. Those projects are active now in terms of coming online over the next 3 years, but the analysis suggests they won't come online fast enough or in a high enough volume to offset a generic bearish price view in the petrochemical space. For a full table of pricing, stocks, and exports, both the past 5 years as well as our forward view the next 3 years, please visit us at cEntellect.com.